Hello everyone, today we're here with Jon Collins, who is interviewing for the Restorative Forum again. This is the second time, so thank you very much for your time, Jon. One thing that I was wanting to talk about first as an introduction is to get a bit of an idea of what the Restorative Justice Council in the UK actually is, because I think that some people think that it's dependent on the government, but it's not actually, it's an independent charity.
That's right, so the Restorative Justice Council is an independent charity and a membership organisation. So our members are the organisations and individuals across England and Wales who are responsible for delivering restorative justice and restorative justice training, and that includes within the criminal justice sector, but also more widely in education, healthcare and communities. And as an organisation, as a charity, we really take on three main roles. Firstly, we set standards for the restorative practice field, so to ensure that wherever restorative practice is used, it's delivered to a high standard. And we put in place accreditation mechanisms to allow people to demonstrate that they meet those standards. Secondly, it's our role to promote the use of restorative practice across the country. So that's both promoting awareness and understanding of restorative practice to the public, but also making sure that people working within relevant organisations in the criminal justice sector, but also in education and other fields, understand what restorative practice is and what its benefits can be. And finally, as a membership organisation, part of our role is supporting our members and enabling them to work together, to share best practice, to share learning with each other, and to enable them to work together and to collaborate.
Okay, that's very interesting. You touched upon the fact that you don't restrict yourself to the criminal justice system. You're actually working you're quite involved in restorative justice in education and also healthcare, which I think is quite innovative at the moment. Can you tell us more about those two things?
Yes, I mean, the majority of our work, as in the majority of restorative practice in this country, takes place in the criminal justice sector. But we also do work increasingly in other sectors. Probably the most prominent is within the education sector. A couple of schools have already got our Restorative Service Quality Mark, which is the quality mark for services to demonstrate that they're delivering restorative practice to a high standard. And more are now going through that process. And we increasingly work with schools who are looking to develop restorative practice within their schools, or looking to develop a whole school restorative model, to support them to do that and to put them in touch with other people who are already working in that way so that they can learn from each other and share their experiences.
Can I ask you, why would a school want to undergo this sort of accreditation? What's the benefit for the school, and how it can help the school excel?
I think every school wants to know, whatever they're doing, that they're doing it to a high standard. And restorative practice is no different. When schools try and implement restorative practice across the school, when they try and train their staff, when they try and use what they've done to improve the school, there can be real challenges in doing that, and there can be a lack of confidence in schools that what they're doing right. By undergoing the quality mark process, they have independent external verification of the quality of what they do, that they can learn from that to improve any areas that need improving, and part of our quality mark process includes an action plan if it's required to bring them up to the standards, but also further pointers for development, other things they could do to continue to improve.
So I think in a way as well, from the point of view of parents considering different schools, if one is certified in this way, I mean, it's like going to an accountant and making sure that that person is qualified to do what it's supposed to do. So that's a benefit for the school as well in marketing terms.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that parents can be nervous when a school's using restorative practice, and they can be worried that it means that incidents won't be dealt with properly or whatever it might be. And I think that having an independent quality mark which demonstrates they're doing it really well can help to reassure parents. It can also make it easier to recruit teachers who are interested in restorative practice. They'll know they're going somewhere that is doing something well. And the whole quality mark process also can boost the profile of a school and help to get broader recognition in their community and in the restorative practice field, but they're a real leader in terms of the way that they're working. So there's a kind of validation and a morale boost for staff to know that what they're doing is really good. One of the things we often get from our quality mark process, whether it's in the criminal justice sector, education or anywhere else, is that they really feel that staff benefit from going through the process and having it recognised by the national body for the field that what they're doing is good, and that makes them feel more positive about what they're doing and more confident about developing their work in the future.
That's right, and a lot of organizations use training as an incentive for people as well. So, I mean, if you give your staff the opportunity to become more skilled and better trained and certified, obviously, that is viewed by many but as an incentive.
Yeah, and I think it helps staff who are thinking of moving on from that school in the future as well. It's something that they've done. It means that they can say they've worked for an accredited school that's operating at the highest standard. So it's another benefit to the staff as well to have been able to say they worked there and been part of that. And we know that staff who've worked in the schools or in the other agencies and other sectors who have the RSQM have been able to talk positively about that when they're looking to move on.
RSQM doesn't imply that people train with you.
Absolutely not. So the Restorative Justice Council, we're not a training provider, we're not a service provider, we don't deliver services ourselves. So what we're offering to schools and others isn't training, it's an accreditation process that benchmarks whether or not they're meeting the standards. So people who are working in RSQM organisations could have been trained by anybody on our list of training providers, assuming they've been trained properly and to the proper standards. So part of what we're looking at when we're doing the accreditation process isn't whether or not they're doing things the way, it's not whether or not we've trained them, it's whether they've been trained properly to a high standard and they've got the skills they need to do the jobs that they're doing.
Well, that's great. That's good to have in mind. Restorative justice in healthcare, what's that about?
So that's very much an emerging sector, and there are a number of areas where there's just the early signs of restorative practice being used. So there's a number of areas in which it can be used in different ways in the healthcare sector. So within, for example, secure mental health institutions, increasingly they're using restorative practice in some examples to deal with conflict between patients or between patients and staff, much in the same way as they would do in a prison or a school, but in a different sort of setting. And we even see that sometimes in sort of more conventional hospital settings as well. It's also used, there are some examples of, we would like to see more of it, being used to deal with complaints by patients against hospitals or doctors or other healthcare providers, where they're starting to embed a restorative element into the complaints process. So we're just starting to see some sort of early stages of development, people thinking about this, starting to use it. There are some real examples in the secure hospital estate of it being used quite extensively. So while it's not maybe as far along as some of the other sectors where we do more kind of standards and accreditation work, we see it as part of our role in promoting the use of restorative practice to look at where it's being used in new sectors and what we can do to help to enable that to happen and to link them up with other people working in similar settings, even in different sectors, and think what they can learn from each other. So if you're trying to use restorative practice to manage conflicts within a hospital setting, what can you learn from schools or prisons or other institutions that have done the same thing? And vice versa, what can people who've been doing it for a long time learn from new sectors where they try it and they tweak it and adjust it to adapt to their settings? What can people who've been doing it for a long time learn from their experience of introducing it fresh? So, as an organisation who is an umbrella organisation for the field, and as I mentioned before, see it as a very important part of our work to share best practice and to help people to learn from each other. Thinking about what new sectors can learn from more established sectors is a really important part of that. It's something that we at the RJC would like to do more of, to see what we've learned and what our members have learned from years of embedding this sort of approach in criminal justice and in education in particular. What can be learned in other sectors so they don't have to go through all the same steps and make all the same mistakes that have been made in the past. They can find new mistakes to make and ways that we can help to address that. So I think it's a really important part of the role of an organisation like the RJC to enable that to happen, to enable best practice to be shared.
You know what I was thinking when I was listening to you? You're talking a lot about using restorative justice in different fields, and it looks increasingly as that restorative justice could be viewed as a transferable skill. That is, you can use it in different sectors. Because I've heard about restorative justice being used in the work setting as well to help people resolve workplace conflict. And you talk about prisons, but for example, I know that it is used. I interviewed some people at a special needs school some time ago, and it is used there, much I suppose in the same way as the use of justice is being used in mental health institutions, where you equip people who perhaps have a special difficulty in coping with conflict to have self-management mechanisms and to deal with these sort of issues. So that is a very interesting thing. And I've seen as well vacancies recently for different organizations, not specifically in restorative justice or even in education, where they see an element of restorative justice as being something positive, bringing something positive to the application of if you're going to apply to that job. So that's very good. I think that's quite promising.
I think so, and I think that I think your example of workplaces is a really interesting one. I think increasingly workplaces are looking at new and different ways to deal with and prevent and resolve conflicts. And restorative practice, as part of the sort of broader category of alternative dispute resolution, is increasingly interested in it from the human resources world and from organisations, particularly those who use restorative justice as part of their delivery work, are also looking about how they can learn lessons from that into their workplaces. But more broadly, workplaces are looking at how they can use restorative principles and restorative practice to improve workplace cultures and create stronger staff teams. And I think that people who have worked in the restorative practice field for a long time and understand the values and principles underpinning it will be well placed to contribute to that sort of thing in the future. And I think it's no surprise that it's those organisations who have seen the benefits of restorative justice in their service delivery who are now thinking about how they can apply that to their staff management. And some organisations are already doing that quite extensively. The Youth Restorative Justice work in Surrey has led them in Surrey County Council to start thinking about how they can use restorative practice in their HR work and in their management of staff, for example. Mm-hmm. And a number of schools have adopted a sort of whole school approach to restorative practice, and have started to see that not only in their interactions between staff and the student body, but also their interactions between staff and their management of staff. So I think that that'll be a major, it's already happening in some areas, and it'll be a major growth area for restorative practice in the future. It's something that we're very interested in contributing to, and to thinking more about what a restorative organisation really looks like. So I think it can be a difficult concept to understand and explain to people who aren't familiar with restorative practice. And I think a bit more thinking about what the kind of key elements of a restorative organisation are, and how you can pin that down to help others to implement it and learn from it would be a really interesting piece of work.
It looks to me like one of the challenges for our sector at the moment is getting local authorities perhaps on board. Because you could go school by school trying to explain the benefits of restorative justice, but I think the better way to do it, or the more efficient way to do it, would be to have the local authority on board and saying, right, we sponsor this sort of idea of having restorative justice in schools, in medical centres, in housing and things like that. And that's the best way to do it. But it seems somewhat difficult to get to that point.
I think schools is a particularly interesting example, because more and more under the last coalition government and this government, the move has been towards greater autonomy for schools and much less control for local authorities. So both academies and free schools are being set up largely outside the local authority umbrella. Even those schools that are still local authority managed schools, they have much more autonomy in how they manage individual schools. So local authorities and the Department for Education has much more of a hands-off approach to what's going on in individual schools. There may be benefits from that from a broader policy agenda, but in terms of trying to convince schools to adopt a restorative approach, it means you have to almost, as you say, go school by school. The exception, of course, is academy chains, who in some ways are replacing local authorities as the sort of decision makers for large groups of schools. So academy chains and multi-academy trusts, a new area for us at the Restorative Justice Council in terms of who the key people are who we need to persuade of the benefits of restorative practice. Because what we've got at the moment is a number of schools working individually to use restorative practice, and some areas where there's been a more collaborative attempt to embed restorative approaches. Obviously, Hull being the sort of historical example of that, and Leeds increasingly moving towards being a restorative city through their children's services department. So there are examples of it going on, but more and more we're looking at how we can influence schools now across the piece when they're much more autonomous than they used to be. And that's the direction of travel in the criminal justice sector as well. So we know that there's a move towards making prisons more autonomous. The probation sector is much more autonomous than it used to be in terms of community rehabilitation companies to set their own agenda. So the days when the only people you had to convince around the use of restorative justice were people in the Ministry of Justice and the National Offender Management Service, increasingly it feels like instead of talking to 3 people at NOMS headquarters, I'm talking to over 100 prisons, 20 CRCs. So it's a much more difficult job to necessarily get round and speak to them all. But the benefits are that if you can convince a prison governor, they can make things happen in their prison actually very quickly. And similarly with CRCs, if you can convince the chief executive of a CRC, they can actually make things happen very quickly. So there's some of those more direct benefits if you can win somebody over making it happen. And there's still a role, of course, for the national structures. So, NOM still has an important part to play in setting the agenda for public prisons. The Ministry of Justice still has a lot of work that it can do to promote restorative justice. So it's a blend between national level convincing and work there, and work more at a local level to make sure things happen operationally on the ground.
I have to agree with you, having been a civil servant myself, that it is to a degree quite good the fact that the whole country doesn't depend on the opinion or personal values of one person sitting at the top in one ministry. So that if you can go to a prison or you can go to a school, and you might have a 50-50 chance that it will be accepted. Hopefully, a higher chance that it will than it not, because it's a benefit. But then, not getting it in one place doesn't preclude you from trying it in another place. Whereas if you have an overarching organization or a mandate from above, then your bets are much smaller, and you have to just go through that one person. I'm glad that you went into community rehabilitation companies and rehabilitation in prisons and things like that, because you have been blogging quite prolifically about those things in the last year as well. We have dealt with education, which you have mentioned in a few times in your blogs, which, by the way, are also on the Restorative Forum. What can you tell us about the outlook for rehabilitation in the UK?
I don't think it's any secret that it's quite a challenging environment out there at the moment. The prison system is facing a lot of challenges around violence and safety, and that is now the overriding agenda for most prison governments. That's been on the news recently
as well.
It's been in the news a lot recently. I think that you only need to look at some of the data for the last few years to be able to see that not only as the state of our prisons getting worse, but it's getting worse at an increasing rate. So there's a lot of work to do there for prison governors around ensuring that first and foremost they're running a safe environment for people to be held in. And there's an important role for restorative practice there. Over the last couple of months we've been travelling around the country talking to prison governors from about 60-odd prisons so far, and it's clear that there's a lot of interest in restorative practice and how it can be used to create a safer prison environment. So I think there's a real opportunity there for the use of restorative practice within prisons to manage conflict between prisoners, to manage conflict between prisoners and staff, and also to deal with issues like drug use, so to help prisoners to understand the consequence of drug-using behaviour within the prison system. So there's potential there, but there's a risk at the same time that because of that focus on prison safety and security, there's less time to focus on rehabilitation and the use of restorative justice with victims outside of the prison walls. So there's work there to try and ensure that doesn't get lost with the new focus on prison safety. I think maybe somewhat similarly with community rehabilitation companies and the rehabilitation work they do, there's been so much focus recently on embedding the new model and getting CRCs up and running and trying to get basic processes running well and delivering sort of core services to an acceptable level at a time when it's been well reported that funding within CRCs is tight and that the pace and scale of change has been really challenging. There's a risk that restorative justice gets seen as an additional extra, a sort of thing that you can do as and when resources are available. But across both prisons and CRCs, we know now that there are some examples of people who are doing it really well, who are making the time and the resources available to do restorative justice to a high standard. And if they can do it, everyone can do it. So an important part of our work this year, in which prisons and CRCs are two of our priority areas, is about looking at who's doing it well and how they're doing it well, and then helping those who are maybe doing less restorative justice to learn how they could go about doing it. And it'll be up to those individual prisons, those CRCs, to decide whether or not they think it's a useful use of resources to copy those areas that are working well, or at least to learn from them to develop their own processes. And we think there's a very strong case for using restorative justice. We think that there is a strong argument for using restorative justice, and we therefore think that if we can show how people will do it, then they'll be willing to try. And certainly prison governors that we've been speaking to, the CRCs that we've been speaking to, are engaged with and interested in using restorative justice. So the challenge really will be for them about how they can do it within the resources available, and that's what we're trying to help them with.
Listening to you, I was thinking, in the CRC sector, as much as in any other, when it comes to the third sector, it's getting dark. you have small players, and then you have increasingly the bigger players that may come from other sectors that see an opportunity here in transforming rehabilitation in particular, and they're entering the fray. Do you think that there is a clear difference between those that perhaps local charities, local organizations that have been doing some work in terms of rehabilitating and helping ex-offenders, and the bigger ones that might be, like I said, seeing an economic opportunity there over what's actually contributing to society or to the communities?
I don't think so necessarily. I mean, all the CRCs are run by large organisations. They simply have to be able to deliver a contract on that scale. The size and the scope of it means that there needs to be an overarching organisation, whether it's a voluntary sector organisation or a private sector organisation. They need to be big. It's just simply to be able to manage a contract of that size. Most of them, as far as I'm aware, are working with in partnership with local organisations of various different kinds to help deliver their rehabilitation services. I think that's very much the model. I don't think it's happening to the extent that it could be or probably will be over a longer period. And that's true for the restorative justice field as well. I think that there's a hope that over time the CRCs will partner with local organisations with a track record of delivering restorative justice. That's happened in a relatively piecemeal way in some areas. I think there could be a lot more of it. I think that it's not that CRCs don't want to be effective in rehabilitating offenders and they don't want to deliver on the kind of goals that were set for them in terms of rehabilitation. I think it's more just that the last few years they've had to achieve a huge amount in a short period of time in terms of simply getting up and running. And money is time. We know money is time. We know that they're running on smaller budgets than they originally intended. So things are getting squeezed out. And the challenge for us and for others in the restorative justice field is to make sure that restorative justice is one of those things that does make the cut, that does survive, that they do prioritise. And to do that, we need to convince them that it's worthwhile. It's not just worthwhile on money terms, that's part of it. Of course it is. They need to be able to justify spending money on it. But it'll help make the difference for the offenders that they manage. And for a lot of these organisations at the top level, they're relatively new to the criminal justice sector. They're relatively new to probation work. So on that basis, they understand that they need to seek out what works and they need to embed that into their practice. And for that reason, I think that a lot of them are interested in restorative justice. They do understand there's a financial and research-based case for it, but at the same time, they need to make sure that if they're going to invest in it, it's going to deliver. And that's the case that we need to make too.
Well, hearing to you, I find it quite interesting because one of the things that you do as an organisation is a lot of research, and I suppose that is one of the fundamental items that underpin the expansion of restorative justice practice here in the UK. Can you tell us a bit about your priorities in terms of research and what the Restorative Justice Council is looking into at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all it's worth saying that obviously there is already an extensive evidence base behind restorative justice. There's been more research done on the efficacy of restorative justice than on almost any other intervention in the criminal justice sphere. So there's a strong research base behind it, and when you're talking about simply demonstrating that it reduces reoffending or has high victim satisfaction rates, I'm not sure there's much more research that can be done on those questions. Researchers feel that case has been made. I do think there's still important research to do, particularly around particular segments of the population or around particular impacts of restorative justice more generally. So we did a piece of work last year on use of restorative justice with female offenders, for example, and we would like to do more work on that.
And that's on the Restorative Forum, by the way, so anyone wants to consult it, it's already there as well.
Yeah,
as well as on your website.
It's on the website. There's a report of the research, but there's also a sort of briefing for practitioners looking at what the implications are for people in actual practice for working with female offenders. We're doing a similar piece of work this year, actually, looking at young Black, Asian and minority ethnic offenders and their interaction with the restorative justice field. There's a perception among some restorative justice practitioners that young offenders from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds are less likely to engage in restorative justice than their sort of peers from white backgrounds. So we're looking at speaking to both practitioners and to young people as part of our research project to look at whether there is any evidence to back up that belief, and also what could be done to improve young Black, Asian, minority ethnic people's engagement with restorative justice and their experience of taking part. That's one of the research projects we're doing this year, which will report in sort of March 2017. We're also doing a broader piece of research work which will look at how you can improve victim take-up of restorative justice. So, as people will know, police and crime commissioners were funded to provide restorative justice to victims of crime in their area. In some areas, police and crime commissioners are concerned that not enough victims are taking part in restorative justice. We know from the research evidence, we know from the experience of some of the longer established agencies that you can get significant victim take-up. So what we're looking at doing is what are those factors that ensure that victims are given a proper choice about whether or not to take part and are able to make an informed decision on whether or not they want to take part in restorative justice. We never argue and don't believe that any victim should be in any way pressured into taking part or should feel they have to take part. But we do think that at the moment there are some victims who could be taking part who aren't. And that's partly around structural factors, whether or not they're actually ever offered it, when, by who, and also about how that offer is made and what's then done to follow up on those that aren't sure or are considering taking part. So we're doing that piece of research to look at how you could essentially boost victim engagement with restorative justice, which will similarly report towards the end of this year. I think the next big piece of research that we'd like to do, which is sort of in the planning phase at the moment, which would be a more significant project, is to look in more detail at the impact that restorative justice has on victims. So we know that victim satisfaction is very high. We know that victims who take part feel immediately afterwards that they've benefited from the experience. But I think there's more work to do to think about what the sort of medium and longer term impact on those victims is. There's been some work done around post-traumatic stress disorder and how restorative justice can reduce the symptoms of that over the medium term. We'd like to look more generally at what the impact of taking part of restorative justice is on victim well-being, partly because a lot of funding for restorative justice now comes through the victim surcharge and victims funding. We'd like to be able to build the case why that should continue and grow, but also because local health and well-being boards and others are thinking about what role restorative justice could play in sort of furthering their agenda, and a lot of that is around how does it help victims to recover from crime, what difference does it make? So I think there is more work to do around that, and I think if we have one research project that we could do, that would be the next one that we'd be looking at. And I know that a number of other people have started doing work in this area, so looking at how we can collaborate with that and try and make sure that the case for saying that restorative justice helps victims to recover from crime and move on is as strong as it could possibly be. Because we know from the victims who we work with, from the services that we work with, that restorative justice can be transformative for those people who take part. You only need to read the case studies on our website or in Resolution, our magazine, to see the difference that it makes for those individuals. So building that evidence base around those case studies to be able to prove that on a more systematic level, I think would really benefit the whole field and would benefit us in making the case to government, to victims' organisations and to other potential funders for the field. So that's something that we're looking at and we'd very much like to do in the future.
That's very interesting. I'm going to say one thing. I did receive a copy of your magazine. It's very, very good. So if you want to receive it as well, become a member.
Absolutely. All of our members get a copy of the magazine. It's well worth it.
I'll put your website there so that anyone interested can go in there. About the last thing, it's interesting that you're talking about victim well-being and victim satisfaction. And there's a lot of studies that focus on reduction in reoffending. I think reduction in reoffending is very attractive to certain officials who concentrate in tackling crime in their areas, whereas victim satisfaction is something more that you can sell to people in general. So it can be used more as a tool for raising awareness among the population as a whole. Because obviously victims are not necessarily that interested about lowering victim reoffending rates. They're talking about what pertains to victims, their well-being, satisfaction, and things like that. So I think that's a very interesting point. There's a lot of work that has been already with reoffending. I think that it has been established that restorative justice works very well for reducing reoffending among offenders. And I think that that's a very interesting area to go into as well, the victim well-being in the long term.
Yeah, and I think that increasingly, police and crime commissioners are funded by the Ministry of Justice to provide support services for victims, and the Ministry of Justice rightly wants to be clear about what the outcomes of those funding are, what they actually achieve in terms of helping victims to recover. And I don't think that the restorative justice field should be in any way nervous about that shift towards thinking about what difference is made by victim services, I think there's an incredibly strong case to make. The restorative justice can have a transformative effect on the victims who take part and can really make a significant difference towards helping them recover. And I think the more we can evidence that, the more likely it is that the restorative justice field will be able to attract a greater proportion of that funding that's made available for victims. And I also think it's important to note that when you talk to victims, and the evidence shows this, that one of the things that they really want to see happening is they want to make sure that the offender doesn't reoffend, that there isn't another, that they or anybody else isn't the victim of crime in the future. So the fact that restorative justice delivers both in one package, it helps victims to feel better, but it also helps to reduce reoffending, which is good for the victim and also good for the broader criminal justice sector, as you know. Means that it is a very attractive package to both victim services suppliers and to the sort of people who manage rehabilitation. That's why I think that despite the sort of the more devolved picture that we talked about earlier, I do think there's still a very important role for the Ministry of Justice to play in making sure that those people managing offenders and those people providing services to victims work together to make restorative justice available. Because for restorative justice to happen, you need the victim and the offender. So you need the collaboration between the two agencies who are responsible for managing those two people through the system. We did some work last year, and again there's a report on our website looking at multi-agency partnerships in delivering restorative justice. And I think there's more work to do to think about how PCC commission services, CRCs, prisons and others work together to deliver restorative justice effectively. There's very limited resources available across the piece. And you need to make sure that you're neither duplicating effort nor leaving gaps within the different services. So I think an important role for us and for the Ministry of Justice nationally is to think more about how those different service providers can collaborate around restorative justice and to make sure that services are being delivered effectively. And we met with a new minister who's responsible for restorative justice just recently, and clearly he's very keen, rightly, on two things. One, demonstrating outcomes, making sure that what we're doing is making a difference, and two, efficiency, making sure that services are being delivered in the most efficient and effective way. And I think that that'll be the next big thing for the restorative justice field. It won't be really to demonstrate that they can reduce reoffending or improve victim satisfaction with those victims who they work with or those offenders who work with. We know that already, we know that's already happening. It's about demonstrating that, but it's also about making sure that they're working together to ensure that the most possible people are getting access to restorative justice for the funding that's available. And that'll be the big challenge, and that's something that we're looking at, helping police and crime commissioners to collaborate to share best practice, helping police and crime commissioners to work with CRCs and others to prevent duplication, and to ensure that where there are effective local partnerships, which there are in some areas, that other areas can learn from that. Whatever their delivery model is locally, they can learn from what works in ensuring that people work together effectively. So that's something that we I think have an important role to play, and the Ministry of Justice has an important role to play in signalling that that's what's expected. What's expected is local collaboration to make this happen, and I think that always national government has a role to play both in making that happen, but also in sending a clear signal that that's what's expected. And that's what I would anticipate coming from the Ministry of Justice over the next few months and over the next few years, is maybe less directional control, but a clear message around what's being expected. And
Kind
much
of leadership.
Leadership and strong monitoring that it's happening. So they're not going to tell you how you've got to do it. They're going to want to make sure that the money they're spending is being used effectively. When we talked to the Minister, he was very clear that he would expect to see clear evidence of how any Ministry of Justice funding, including for restorative justice, is making a difference. And that's, I think, something that the field should expect over the coming years. If they receive any form of statutory funding from national government, whether it's directly or through some sort of local arrangement, they will be expected to demonstrate what difference they've made. And I genuinely think, and I've always thought that's a good thing. I think that there is a wholly positive story to tell about what difference restorative justice makes, and we can be confident that by comparison with any other service that's being offered to victims or to being offered to offenders, we've got something positive to say about the difference that we can make. And I think the Ministry of Justice will be wanting to see that evidenced, and I think that if we can do that, that will only help restorative justice to grow further.
Well, you effectively hijacked my last question, which was what are your expectations looking forward? Is there anything that you want to add?
I think the only thing to say is, as ever, since I've been at the Restorative Justice Council and doing these interviews, there's not much money around, resources are tight, there's not going to be any more money coming from central government or locally anytime soon. So I think that the real challenge will be demonstrating that restorative justice is a core service, that it's not an additional extra that's done as and when money is available. It should be a core part of what is done in the criminal justice sector. So I think in the criminal justice world, that will be the real challenge. It'll be around demonstrating impact and showing that what we're doing makes a difference. But I think the other sort of major area for us over the next 6 months or a year is thinking about how we can expand the use of restorative practice in other sectors. We started off the interview talking about that. There's a lot already been done in education, and we're doing a lot at the moment to try and push that out more widely, and also helping to support the development of restorative practice in other sectors where it's maybe less well established. So the criminal justice world, obviously it's the most established area. We can't take our eye off it for a minute, there's much more to do. There's also a lot of work for us to do in other sectors, and it's important for us not to lose sight of that.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time. I think that this was a very interesting conversation. I think we have probably learned a lot of things about the Restorative Justice Council and potential areas for improvement in terms of implementing restorative justice. So thank you very much for offering this second interview here in the Restorative Forum, and thank you for your time.
No problem, thanks very much.